Okay, well, just before we start, I just wanted to thank the JW3 and Sam McLeod in particular, who are just the most brilliant venue to work with. I do a lot of events in lots of different venues, and this is by far the loveliest and the easiest to work with. And then also, really, thank you very much to all the Our Fight volunteers. There's a big team of them, and they've been here for a long time today, and without it, it wouldn't be possible to put on something like this. Okay, so welcome to the first session of the day, Anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and Genocide. What we want to start the day with is a very open discussion of the problems that confront us today when it comes to the way in which the Holocaust or the Shoah is understood or misunderstood. If we are to remake the promise of never again, then we're going to have to try to work on creating a shared meaning of what the Holocaust was. And I think this is a mixed audience of Jews and non-Jews, and we're going to have to try and work on creating a shared meaning across both of those constituencies. And I have to say, I think we're further away from that than we ever have been outside of this room, at least. However, we're very lucky to have two excellent speakers to help us start to remake some progress in this regard. Our first speaker is Jonathan Sacerdoti, and he will share with us a lecture for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have a response from our second speaker, Daniel Ben-Ami, and then we'll come out to you for some questions once they've challenged each other and raised questions that arise from their introductory remarks. So just to introduce both of our speakers, so Jonathan is a journalist, a broadcaster and a producer. He'll be familiar to many of you, I'm sure, because he regularly appears on BBC, Sky News, Fox News, an unenviable task in the past period, CBS, ABC, I24 News, where he serves as the UK and Europe correspondent. In addition to that, you'll have read his work in the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Spectator, the New Statesman, Jewish Chronicle, and many other publications. And I should also say that he's also shown himself willing to get out and about on a cold and windy day to address crowds large or small at street protests and vigils. We were last together at our Charlie Hebdo memorial in Trafalgar Square earlier in January. So that's Jonathan, and we'll hear from here in a moment. And then on my left here we have Daniel Ben-Ami. Daniel is an author and journalist. He's contributed to numerous national, specialist and international publications and written books including Ferraris for All and Cowardly Capitalism. I was looking back at the Spiked archive and seeing just how many articles Daniel's written there. He may have forgotten, but since 2001, it took pages and pages of scrolling to find them all. But in particular, he started to write on anti-Semitism and on Israel since 2017, I think I noted. You might dispute that. And in 2023, he launched the Radicalism of Fools website on rethinking anti-Semitism in the belief that the mainstream discussion is failing to grapple with this thorniest of subjects. And I know that he's alerted to many of us in this room to the resurgence of anti-Semitism if we weren't aware of it spontaneously through our own experience. He alerted us to it politically and intellectually through his writings on his blog and in Spiked. So first of all, I want to invite Jonathan to take to the lectern to introduce us. Thank you.
What does it mean to say never again? It's etched into memorials, it's inscribed in textbooks, it's whispered in the shadows of history's darkest hour. It's a phrase that's uttered by world leaders at solemn ceremonies, by teachers guiding young minds through the horrors of the past, and by those who stand in Auschwitz tracing their fingers over the cold, cracked walls of the barracks. It's repeated so often that it risks becoming just that, a repetition. Is it a promise, a warning, a plea, a moral incantation to ward off the unthinkable? For some, never again means Jews will never again be led to the slaughter, that the gas chambers, the mass graves, the methodical machinery of annihilation will never be allowed to return. For others, it's a broader appeal, that genocide itself must never again be permitted, that humanity must learn, must evolve, and must overcome its worst instincts. Some evoke it as a lesson about fragility of democracy, the dangers of authoritarianism, the capacity of man's inhumanity to man. But over time, as it has been stretched, reshaped, and universalized, has it lost its very essence? Never again has in some quarters ceased to be about Jews at all. It's been repurposed, rebranded, and sometimes even turned against us. How often have we heard that because of the Holocaust, we Jews should know better? The ultimate lesson of Jewish suffering is that we must be moral exemplars, that we must offer no resistance, that our historical trauma somehow obliges us to endure fresh violence in silence. What then are we really promising? Because if never again is merely an exercise in memory, if it's a phrase reserved for poems and candlelight vigils, if it's a convenient slogan but not an imperative for action, then we've already broken it. On October the 7th, as Jews were slaughtered in their homes, as families were burnt alive, as women were raped beside the bodies of their children, there were those who looked upon this horror and did not recoil. They did not grieve, they did not condone. They did not condemn. They mobilized. In London, just 5 hours after Hamas burst over the border, activists were already planning a protest, not against the murderers, but against the murdered. The blood was still wet, the bodies were still warm, and yet the chants had already begun. This is the world we live in. And so I ask again, what does never again really mean? There is a modern impulse, subtle, insidious, to universalize the Holocaust, to smooth its jagged specificity, to fold it into the broader fabric of human cruelty, to turn it into a generic warning about intolerance. In 2022, the American comedian Karen Elaine Johnson, who goes by the Jewish stage name Whoopi Goldberg, commented on the popular American TV show The View that the Holocaust wasn't about race. It was about man's inhumanity to man, an argument between two groups of white people. How convenient. If the Holocaust was simply about inhumanity, then it belongs to no one and everyone. It becomes a parable, an abstract moral failing, a floating lesson unmoored from the reality of what actually happened. It demands nothing of history, nothing of responsibility, nothing of vigilance. It allows the world to say, this is not my story. This is not my failure. It exists as a warning to all and as the burden of none. It becomes a story of what people do to people, rather than what was done to the Jews. But the Holocaust was not some open-ended tragedy. It was not a crime against some vague notion of humanity. It was an attempt to erase the Jewish people. Of course, we should all learn from the Holocaust, but we cannot allow a universal message to erase the particular truth, that the Holocaust was a campaign for the total systematic extermination of the Jewish people. Not for our land, not for our wealth, not for our politics, but for our very existence. Yes, others were persecuted: Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, the disabled. The Nazis brutalized and enslaved many. But there was only one group that was signaled out for total eradication. Jews were not just unwanted, they were intolerable. From the Warsaw Ghetto to the forests of Lithuania, From the villages of Greece to the streets of Amsterdam, they did not pause to consider who was politically active, who was rich or who was poor, who was religious or who was secular. The only criterion was Jewish blood. And yet today that truth is being diluted. This year, on Holocaust Memorial Day, Good Morning Britain presenter Ranveer Singh introduced a report on King Charles's visit to Auschwitz by saying 6 million people were killed in concentration camps during the Second World War, as well as millions of others because they were Polish, disabled, gay, or belonged to another ethnic group. People, not Jews, not Jewish people. Our Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, shared online a photo of her lighting a candle. She wrote, "Tonight, I'm lighting a candle to remember all those who were murdered just for being who they were." Statements from councils across the UK didn't mention Jews. In Lowestoft, at a council-organised wreath-laying ceremony, Jews were not even invited to lay a wreath. The Anti-Religion Humanists UK organisation posted online about all the victims of genocide. The Canadian Prime Minister spoke about all the victims of genocide. In Dublin, the Irish President Michael D. Higgins gave a speech politicising the Holocaust by drawing false equivalents between it and the ongoing war in Gaza, a war instigated by a genocidal group that massacred Jews. As she took a stand against this outrage, a Jewish Israeli-Irish PhD student was forcibly removed from the audience. Even the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust decided to issue an official invitation this year that shamefully focused on, I quote, "the devastating violence against Palestinian civilians in Gaza." This year on Holocaust Memorial Day, the word Jew seemed to be out of fashion. And these are not careless omissions. This is a quiet erasure. It is history being rewritten in real time, moulded into something softer, something more comfortable. But the 6 million were not murdered as an indistinct mass of humanity. They were murdered as Jews. And if the world forgets that, if it strips the Holocaust of its essence and reduces it to an empty platitude, then it will fail to recognise when history begins to rhyme once more. There is a danger in memorials. Not in their existence, they are essential, but in their quiet finality. They stand as symbols of what was lost, as markers of what must never be forgotten. Yet they risk something deeper. They risk trapping the past in stone or in concrete in the stillness of history, while the present roars past unheeded. They risk embalming history, freezing it in time, looking at it behind glass, as though it were no longer a living, breathing part of our present. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, one of the great scholars of Jewish memory, understood this danger. In his seminal work, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, he explained that for much of Jewish history, it wasn't historians who preserved the past. It wasn't books or archives that kept Jewish history alive. It was rituals, prayers, and storytelling. The rhythms of Jewish life that wove history into the fabric of daily existence. To be Jewish was to remember, not in abstraction, but as if history itself was alive, urgent, present. To remember was a commandment, a sacred act. Zachor, remember. Yerushalmi suggests that museums often serve as places where history is preserved but no longer lived. And unlike Jewish rituals like Passover, where the past is reenacted and made present, museums create a distance between people and history, treating memory as an object rather than a continuous experience. Yerushalmi feared that this shift might hollow out Jewish identity, that remembrance would become passive, detached and academic. And nowhere is that fear more relevant than in how we remember the Holocaust today. Take Berlin. In the heart of the city, just a few steps away from where Hitler's bunker once was, stands the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. 2,711 concrete slabs rising from the ground in solemn, silent rows. It is vast, cold, disorienting, a physical representation of loss. But does it prevent anti-Semitism? Does it stop hatred from taking root again? A short walk from that memorial, Jewish children were warned not to wear kippot in public. In 2023, the Kachal Adas Yisrael synagogue in Berlin was firebombed by two men, just 12 days after the 7th of October invasion of Israel. Or consider Hyde Park in London last year, where officials covered over the Holocaust memorial with a blue tarpaulin during a so-called pro-Palestinian march. Not because it had been vandalized, but as a precautionary measure. They feared that leaving it exposed might provoke the crowd. The memorial to the 6 million was desecrated not by extremists. It was hidden by those who are tasked with its protection. The irony is unbearable. A monument built to ensure never again was hidden to appease those who chant for it to happen again. This is where we are. We've built monuments to the past, but we failed to apply their lessons to the present. We light candles, we recite prayers, we say never again, but all the while anti-Semitism festers. We are preserving the memory of the Holocaust, but we are stopping the forces who would stop this happening again. Yerushalmi understood that memory cannot simply be carved in stone. It must live. And yet we are failing to let it live. We have traded the immediacy of memory for the sterility of memorialization. We've locked the past away in monuments while the present rages unchecked. So I ask you, is Never Again merely a call to build museums, to lay wreaths and to light candles, or is it a demand to act, to fight? To ensure that history's echoes are silenced before they become its verses. Because if we leave the Holocaust entombed in the past, we are not honouring the dead, we're abandoning the living. If we're waiting for the next Holocaust to arrive dressed in the same uniform, we won't see it coming. It won't announce itself with jackboots and yellow stars, nor will it begin with cattle cars and ghettos. History does not repeat itself. It rhymes. Anti-Semitism has always adapted to its era, shape-shifting to fit the language and the anxieties of the time. In the Middle Ages, it was religious. Jews as Christ killers or Satan, as heretics who poisoned wells and spread the plague. In Nazi Germany, it was racial. Jews as vermin, as parasites, an existential threat to Aryan purity. And today it's political. Jews as oppressors, as colonizers, as a foreign presence with no right to exist. The accusations have changed, but the logic remains the same. The Jew is always the problem, and the world would be better without him. Look at what's happening now. A new generation raised on the language of human rights has been taught to believe that Jews, this ancient, indigenous, repeatedly exiled people, are somehow foreign invaders in their own homeland. The Holocaust was barely a lifetime ago, and yet we hear that the descendants of its survivors are now the ones committed to genocide. The irony is grotesque. The accusation is familiar. Europe, the world, will never forgive the Jews for the Holocaust. And then there was October the 7th. as Jews were burned alive in their homes, as infants were shot in their beds, as families were dragged from their houses and slaughtered, something chilling happened. The world did not grieve. It did not condemn. Instead, almost immediately, it turned on the victims. In London, within hours of the massacre, activists were already planning an anti-Israel protest. In Sydney, as news of the atrocity spread, a crowd gathered on the steps of the Opera House, lighting flares, waving flags, and chanting, "Gas the Jews." And across the world, on university campuses, at political rallies, on social media, a single terrible message emerged. They had it coming. Here, in once Great Britain, an organiser for the Palestine Solidarity Campaign contacted the Metropolitan Police at 12:50 p.m. on the 7th of October 2023 to inform them of the group's intention to protest in the capital the following Saturday. The call was made as Jews were still being slaughtered. They were still cowering in bomb shelters in their homes. They were still being hounded through fields, chased by terrorists who poured through the border fence and paraglided through the air, baying for blood. This is how history rhymes. It's not merely that Jews are murdered, it's that their murder is justified. It's that their self-defense should be protested against. It's that in the eyes of the world, Jewish suffering is always secondary to someone else's grievance. The question is, will we recognize the pattern in time? If never again is to mean anything, it must be a promise to the living, not just an elegy to the dead. It cannot be confined to candlelight vigils and slogans or solemn speeches at memorials. It must be a demand, a relentless urge, an urgent call to confront the anti-Semitism of today, not merely to commemorate the anti-Semitism of yesterday. Because anti-Semitism isn't a relic of the past. It's here, now, rising in ways both familiar and also disturbingly new. In Melbourne, Australia, just 2 months ago, masked attackers smashed the windows of the Adass Yisrael synagogue, poured petrol inside, and set it ablaze, forcing worshippers to flee as flames consumed their place of prayer. In Paris in 2018, an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor, Mireille Knoll, was stabbed 11 times and set on fire in her own home by 2 Muslim men. She had survived the Nazis only to be murdered decades later for being a Jew in France. In 2017, Sarah Halimi, a 65-year-old retired physician and schoolteacher, was attacked in her Paris apartment by her neighbour, a 27-year-old Muslim who broke into her home and beat her while shouting Allahu Akbar, and then threw her from the 3rd-floor balcony. Legal proceedings would conclude that he was not criminally responsible due to cannabis use. In 2006, Ilan Halimi, a 23-year-old French Jew, was lured by a young woman to an apartment in the Paris suburbs where he was ambushed by a Muslim gang and kept captive for 24 days, enduring unthinkable torture. Ilan was found near death, his body bearing the scars of prolonged torment, and he succumbed to his injuries shortly thereafter. The list does not end there. It does not even slow down. It stretches across continents and years, accelerating with a terrifying momentum. And nowhere is the rise of anti-Semitism more blatant than on university campuses. In the United States, since October the 7th, there's been a 700% increase in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses, according to Hillel International. Jewish students have been harassed, threatened, and assaulted in classrooms and in lecture halls, in dormitories and in student unions. The message is clear: Jews are not safe. Professors praise Hamas as freedom fighters. Administrators, when asked if calls for genocide against Jews violate their own codes of conduct, hesitate. The political arena is not immune. In Britain, in 2018, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell called for Holocaust Memorial Day to be renamed using an early day motion in the Commons to suggest it should be called Genocide Memorial Day Never Again for Anyone. A clear attempt to erase the unique characteristics of the Holocaust and the centrality of anti-Semitism to the Nazi attempt to exterminate European Jewry. During all these events, and so many others, where was never again? Anti-Semitism has always found new disguises, new justifications, new languages in which to cloak its ancient hatred. It once masqueraded as religion, casting Jews as Christ killers. It then wore the garb of race science, portraying Jews as an impure contamination. And today it speaks the language of anti-colonialism and social justice, reinventing itself as Palestinianism. Make no mistake, this is not about land. It is not about borders. It is about erasure. Those who chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, are not calling for peaceful resolution. They're calling for the obliteration of the only Jewish state in the world. They're not demanding coexistence, but annihilation. In their vision, there's no room for Jews, not in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv, not anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And yet Palestinianism's become the vehicle for a socially acceptable form of anti-Semitism. It dresses itself in the rhetoric of liberation, of resistance, of human rights, and in the name of a cause and a group which has never been shy to declare its intentions to wipe out or completely expel Jews, all inspired by a broader worldwide ideology which sees Jews as worthy of erasure. It casts Jews not as a vulnerable minority, but as a global oppressor class. It does not see Israel as a country, but as an illegitimate foreign entity, one which must be dismantled. This distortion of history is not accidental, it is strategic. This year, the Islamic Human Rights Commission urged councils and universities across the UK to boycott Holocaust Memorial Day because Gaza was not included as a genocide. This was not just an insult to the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. It was an outright attempt to rewrite history. By placing Gaza alongside Auschwitz, by equating Israel's self-defense with the mechanized slaughter of Jews, they sought to hollow out the meaning of the Holocaust itself. And in London, at the Al-Quds March, Hezbollah flags were waved freely in our streets, symbols of a terrorist organization explicitly dedicated to Israel's destruction. Calls for jihad rung out in a city that claims to stand against hate. The mask slipped, and still so many refused to see. So I ask, why do we recognize anti-Semitism when it wears a swastika, but not when it waves a Palestinian flag? Why do we condemn it in history books, but excuse it when it shouts from the streets of our own cities? If never again is to mean anything, it must include the courage to name today's anti-Semitism for what it is. Saul Friedlander, one of the great chroniclers of the Holocaust, understood that while the Shoah was unique, the warning signs of dehumanization repeat throughout history. The Holocaust did not begin with Auschwitz. It began with words, with boycotts, with the quiet indifference of those who looked away. Today, we see those signs again. We see normalization of violence against Jews. We see the world shift the blame from the perpetrators to the victims. We see the grotesque Nazi comparisons. Jews told, "You of all people should know better." As if surviving genocide requires surrendering to the next one. The world swore that it had learned from the past, that it would recognize the warning signs, that it would never remain silent again. And yet, here we are. If never again is to mean anything, it must be more than words whispered at memorials. It must be more than the somber tones of a politician's speech. It must be more than a candle lit once a year. A promise is not a slogan, it's an obligation. And yet, time and time again, we've watched this phrase being uttered without conviction, without urgency, and without action. Because never again is not just about stopping genocide. That is far too low a bar. The world does not wake up one morning and decide to exterminate a people. It happens step by step, warning by warning, tolerated hatred by tolerated hatred. It happens when anti-Semitic slogans go unchallenged, when synagogues burn and we call it isolated, when Jews are murdered in their homes and it's dismissed as a crime of opportunity. Never again is not just about remembering the past. It's about stopping the anti-Semitism of the present. Because anti-Semitism today doesn't look like it did in 1933, but its essence is unchanged. It's Jewish students harassed on campuses. It's synagogues attacked with Molotov cocktails. It's From the River to the Sea projected on Big Ben. It's Jewish children shot in their schools. It's Jews held hostage on Shabbat in a synagogue in Colleyville, or shot dead in a synagogue on Shabbat in Pittsburgh. It's a kosher supermarket siege in Paris. It's Jews being raped at a music festival in Re'im. It's free Palestine. It's Jews control the media. It's journalists twisting history until the victims become the villains. It's Holocaust memorials hidden beneath tarpaulin because even the memory of our suffering is considered offensive. Governments have failed. Universities have failed. The media have failed. The institutions that claim to stand against hate have, time and again, ignored anti-Semitism until it's too loud, too violent, and too undeniable to sweep away. And then they say they're shocked. Elie Wiesel once said, "The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference." And indifference is what we've seen. Indifference as Jews are attacked in their places of worship, in their homes, in the streets of cities where they thought they were safe. Indifference as Hamas's atrocities were excused. Indifference as the world let never again become just another phrase, just another platitude. Must we wait for another 7th of October, another Tree of Life, another Toulouse, or will we act now? Because never again is not a reflection on the past. It's a call to arms for the present. We repeat those words at memorials. We etch them into plaques. We teach them to our children. But history doesn't listen to slogans. It's not moved by promises. It doesn't respect our moments of silence. And so despite all the lessons, despite all the memorials, despite all the warnings, it keeps happening again and again and again. Over and over we say never again out loud, because deep down in silence we know that the truth is forever again. That's why never again cannot be a passive hope. We must make it an active vow. The world has always seen Jewish suffering as a tragedy, but never as a warning. The gas chambers of Auschwitz are mourned, the cattle cars are memorialized, but the Jewish families burnt alive on October the 7th are excused and too easily forgotten. It's easy to condemn the past, to speak with moral clarity about the crimes of another era. It's much harder to recognize the dangers of the present and to stand against anti-Semitism when it stares us in the eye. Never again means recognizing the signs before they reach a new climax. It means understanding that when Jews are scapegoated, demonized, and attacked, the world itself is already shifting into darkness. because anti-Semitism is never just about the Jews. A world in which Jews are hunted is a world on the edge of collapse. And so let us all declare never again. But not as a prayer or a phrase or an empty ritual. To renew this promise is not just to remember, it is to act and to fight back. To refuse to let history rhyme once more. And to ensure that when we say never again, we live it in every moment of every day of our present and our future.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That's exactly what we needed to get the day started. And I'm very, very grateful for you stepping up and taking on that challenge in a really clear and powerful way. Now I want to invite Daniel to offer his responses to the questions that we're addressing today, but also particularly to what Jonathan's just said.
Yeah, thanks, Jan, and thanks, Jonathan, for a very powerful speech. I do want to focus on slight disagreements with Mark and Jonathan, because I should emphasise slight, triple underlined, because I overwhelmingly agree with what Jonathan said. But just to add, I think it is useful to debate some of these things. And what I want to say is, first of all, that there never was a promise of never again. It's a myth. I mean, Jonathan didn't go as far as to claim this, but there's this kind of common view that in 1945, the Allies were so horrified by the Holocaust that they promised that what happened to the Jews in Auschwitz and other extermination camps would never happen again. It would have been great if that was the case, but that did not happen. Although there was some recognition of Jewish suffering, it was seen as kind of collateral damage of the Second World War. There was no understanding of the Holocaust. And historically, never again, generally speaking, and there are exceptions of course, has been kind of generalised that war is horrible. Nie wieder Faschismus in German, never again fascism. It's always been a kind of very general thing, apart from for a small minority. It was only always a small minority who recognised the specificity of Jewish suffering, the specificity, the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And never again, by the vast majority, unfortunately, was seen as a kind of very general exhortation against war. The kind of understanding that Jonathan was quite correctly outlining, very few people had that understanding. That unfortunately was not a sentiment. Doesn't mean that we can't fight it. I think we absolutely have to fight it. But it's never really been a kind of mainstream sentiment in the past. We have to do something that's never been done before. That's my view. And then if I have a little bit of time, I want to talk about the battle of ideas that we need to engage in to win this fight. So to illustrate my point, I want to go back to something that happened to me in the summer of 1976, and the year is important, I'll explain why, when I was visiting Israel with my family for about a month. And I stayed with my family, I was obviously very young, with various different friends of my mother's, including one family, the husband in the family was someone called Shimon. He was a navigator for El Al, the Israel Airlines. The other one, they didn't actually know each other, although both men were very similar. It was called Moshe. And he was a vocational teacher in a high school in Israel. Both middle-aged, both very nice guys, but both a bit kind of quiet and withdrawn. And, you know, it was summer, it was Israel, it was hot. So people generally wore short sleeves. And if you looked at them closely, you would see they had numbers tattooed on their arms. And people, well, my mother said to me, you know, be careful what you say to these people. You know, you don't want to upset them because they were in the camps. And again, this phrase, in the camps, is important, and I'll explain why. They were in the camps So, just be a bit sensitive. Don't ask them, any questions out of the ordinary. So that's what I was told. Now, why is this significant? Well, first of all, the phrase "they were in the camps" is significant. Why? Because nowadays we would call them Holocaust survivors. That's the phrase that generally would be used. But the term Holocaust wasn't really used at that time except in academic circles. It wasn't, in fact, until 2 years later there was a big TV docudrama called Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep, that became a big international phenomenon, that the term Holocaust became a kind of popular term. But the whole idea of the Holocaust, the term Holocaust, and the idea of specific Jewish suffering wasn't really a popular preoccupation until the late 1970s. And that, there's a lot of people here weren't even born in 1976, but it was still 30 years after the Second World War, long after the Second World War had finished, people were not using the term Holocaust. Hence they were saying in the camps. And these guys weren't talking about the Holocaust, and they weren't talking about their experiences. And obviously, I'm sure a few people were, but that was very, very common. People didn't want to talk about it. So all these things that we've come to understand now, all of these Holocaust museums and people talking about the Holocaust, using that term, the Holocaust, talking about Jewish suffering, these are relatively new. The Holocaust Museum that Jonathan mentioned in Berlin, near the Reichstag in central Berlin, I forget the exact date, but about 20 years ago, that was founded. That was, it wasn't something that happened immediately after the Second World War. Or Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain, or internationally, was 2021. So long after the Second World War. So the point I'm making is that the Holocaust, the concept of the Holocaust, but also the idea that there was something specific about Jewish suffering, and also the idea of never again, are relatively new. They don't come from 1945. People started talking about them in the 1970s, and even then, there's always been a lot of ambiguity about it. And even then, the majority view, and there have been honourable exceptions, but the majority view has been the Holocaust is one example. Maybe it has its unique characteristics. Yes, of course, the Jews suffered. People would obviously concede that, apart from the small minority of Holocaust deniers. But there was never a mainstream view that the Holocaust was unique. There was never a mainstream view that never again referred to the Jews. That's just a kind of rewriting of history. That's just not the case. Maybe if I can just use that to relate to my second point, and then I'll open it up for discussion, which is it's actually really, really hard, I think, to win the battle of ideas in relation to this discussion. And we really have to win the battle of ideas, again, because of points that Jonathan alluded to, because you can generally quite easily win an argument against a Holocaust denier. You can throw facts at them and you can ridicule them, and that's great. But the Holocaust relativizers are much more difficult because they will say, of course, the suffering of Jews was terrible. And they, in fact, will often say, yes, of course, the Holocaust had unique features. They will concede that point. But then they will say, but you need to see that the Sinti was slaughtered in the Holocaust, which historically is true. Roma was slaughtered in the Holocaust. They will argue the first German genocide was not the Holocaust, it was in Namibia, or what's now Namibia, in Southwest Africa, in the early 20th century. Colonialism is the radical twin. This is the kind of new terminology. The radical twin of the Holocaust. So if you're a kind of balanced human being, of course you have to recognize, this is their argument, of course you have to recognize the Holocaust, but you have to see it has the radical twin of colonialism, and any decent person would be against all of these things. That's their argument. And we have to say, of course, lots of terrible things have happened. The Holocaust is not the only terrible thing that's happened. And any single Jewish life is not more or less valuable than any non-Jewish life. But there's something specific about anti-Semitism, about it being a specifically visceral form of hatred, and it not, as Jonathan quite rightly said, not just being about Jews. It's a way of, I would argue, it's a way of understanding the good and evil in the world, and seeing Jews as somehow epitomizing what is perceived to be evil in the world. Anti-Semitism is not a prejudice. It's not discrimination. It's something much, much broader than that. But it's very, very hard to win the argument, and we have to win the battle of ideas. I know that Mark has got a announcement in relation to this later on, which I'm not going to preempt, but just to kind of tease it out to mention it to people. So just to conclude, I would say, yes, we have to build an idea of never again. We have to fight for an understanding of the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but this is something that has never been done before. This is something that is very difficult, something very new, but it's a battle that we really have to win.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm aware of the time, so in order to keep running to time, I'm just going to... Jonathan, is there anything directly you want to come back to Daniel on? Should we go out to the floor? Okay. Sorry to hurry. Okay, we've got a microphone there and a microphone there. So if you want to put your hand up, it's quite difficult for me to see because it's quite dark. But if we start towards the back and then work our way down. There's a lady... Yeah, Casper, there's a lady in grey. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gina. Sorry, Mark, I'm going to be the first one. I have maybe a radical suggestion. I completely agree with both of you. Never again, as far as I'm concerned, is a totally impotent term. Why don't we just make a change, Mark? Maybe you'll want to consider it. And maybe we change it for forever again. Because in my opinion, as an Israeli and a Jew, everybody are coming up with Auschwitz, with the camps, with all of that. Yeah, this what, if they even bother to teach in the last 10 years, not only across the world, but also in Israel, they've really diluted the whole effect of World War II. There is a movement in the world to bring the hearts together and to try and diminish the hate and resentment between different nationalities, between different races and religions, etc. But one thing that I am missing, and I'm looking back in the past 2 years, is how much are they really teaching? What brought it about? How did it come about? And by the way, when people talk to me about the Holocaust, oh, you're a Jew and you've been through the Holocaust, I turn to people and I say, well, do you know how many people died in China? Roughly around the same time, Mao. What's the name of the big square in China? Forgive me for Tiananmen Square. 6 million people died there as well. But there is something very unique and very specific about anti-Semitism. And I think the process of what brings it about, what brings about the genocide, is not discussed enough. And that should be discussed forever, again and again and again. Because if you don't remind society what brings it about, how is it coming about, then you're missing the whole point, and you will get never again, just as a statement that is empty.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of hands, but I would like to have some sort of direct responses to that question of terminology. I mean, can we resurrect or reuse something that has become banal, do you think?
Well, I think that never again, as I said, it's so ambiguous what it's about. And I think that that's also what Daniel was saying, is that it wasn't announced one day as we now have this phrase and this is what it means and this is what we refer to by it. So I think that's at once a strength and a weakness in it, because we can all gather together at an event like this and say we are reaffirming the vow of never again, but we need to agree on what it means. So I very strongly wish to say that it should mean never again specifically to Jews and the Holocaust. That might be because I'm a Jew, but I think it's also because of the enormity of what happened. I think there are many lessons to be learned from the Holocaust, for sure, and among them are universal lessons of hatred between groups in society and what have you. But generally speaking, I think the reason that we need to maintain the specificity of the Jewish message is that it's still happening. It didn't stop, and it hasn't stopped, and it's getting worse. And so for me, yes, let's keep the slogan if we want, but it's almost irrelevant whether we do or we don't. I just think more than the slogan, we need to settle on action. We need to agree what it is that we're opposing, what it is that we're saying will never happen again. It can be many things, but it does need to be that we're not going to tolerate Jew hatred, anti-Semitism in any manifestation. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Daniel?
Well, in relation to what Gina said, she touched on Holocaust education. I mean, I think that is a huge problem, Holocaust education, and a lot of the museums are hugely problematic too, because from what I can make out, what people learn in schools, generally speaking, is that the Holocaust was bad, but of course there have been very comparable, similar things that have happened to, as Mark was alluding to before, in Cambodia and Sudan and lots of other places. For a start, I don't think you can teach the Holocaust to young children. For a start, you have to have an understanding of history, to have at least a reasonable understanding of history to understand the significance of the Holocaust. So I don't think it can be taught to young children. I don't think it can be taught to people who don't have any understanding of history. And very often the teachers don't have much understanding of history either, as far as I can make out. Because if you don't have that, it just becomes a kind of banal moral lesson of, yes, you mustn't be nasty to people. Anne Frank, I've got nothing against Anne Frank's book at all, but it's just used very often in teaching just to make these banal lessons that you mustn't be nasty to people, you've got to behave properly, which kind of makes the Holocaust just completely banal. You don't understand what it's about. So I think most Holocaust teaching should be scrapped. Probably a lot of Holocaust museums should be shut down as well. That would be a really good thing for understanding the Holocaust better, in my view.
Good luck with that campaign. You can do the PR for it. Yes, over this side, there's a lady in the pattern top.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mina, and I bought this book, lest we forget, that belonged to my great-uncle, and it's how I learnt about the Holocaust. And do you know something? I am so ashamed of my country and the silence that's coming out of all this of prejudice against our Jewish friends, and it's so serious that we really have to have a very good game plan. And I found I'm 81, I was born in 43. I can just say that when you listen to the arguments between Palestinian rights, the Brits are awfully, they don't like, the poor Palestinians, they haven't got a state, and all this sort of stuff. Nobody anywhere in our propaganda since the war, or the BBC, has explained that the Palestinians themselves rejected the offer of their two states, saying they had no right to
Do you mind
exist.
if I interrupt you? Because at the previous event we discussed specifically the question of the going on in the Middle East, and that's not to shut down the discussion, because you're very welcome to carry on the breaks, but the point about this is to talk about the Holocaust.
Right.
And so I would like us to focus on that, if that's okay. So can we go to the question over here, Casper? Thank you. Sorry to do that, but do talk with people in the break, but I just want to make sure we stay on track.
Thank you. My name is Norman Lewis. I want to challenge you slightly, Jonathan. You spoke about indifference. Because I'm a Jew. I was born in South Africa. I grew up in South Africa, and I ended up in prison in South Africa fighting apartheid, and ended up in Britain as a refugee. But to my shame, and to the shame of many Jews, there were many Jews in South Africa who didn't, who were indifferent to the suffering, the humanitarian suffering of black people in South Africa. And, to this day, I think a lot of Jews in South Africa should stand up and admit that their indifference is precisely the kind of indifference that allows the kind of crap that we see happening today in terms of what's happening with Hamas, how people are excusing Hamas, the kind of indifference to the suffering of what happened on October the 7th. My point really is this, that if we are going to win this argument, then firstly, as Jews, we've got to be honest with ourselves. That we have failed in many instances, that we have stood by and we've watched, and not only have we watched, we've benefited from the indifference to that anti-humanitarian behaviour of our fellow human beings. That if we are going to oppose this, if never again is going to become a thing, I think what you said at the end was completely correct. It's how we conduct ourselves in our daily life, and how the morals that we educate our children with, of what we stand for as human beings. It's about civilization. That's really what we are facing today, because the anti-Semitism today is a kind of modern form of anti-civilization. And if we don't stand and make the case for the human case, the humanitarian case for all of us as human beings, as for the future of humanity on Earth, then I think we are going to lose this argument.
Okay, so this is the theme that comes up all the time, this kind of tension between the particular and the universal. And so one thing, the problem that we seem to have identified is this attempted universalization of the Holocaust has actually rendered it too general and non-specific and allowed other people to capture the meaning of it. So how do you redress the balance, if you like?
Well, listen, I don't disagree with you that as humans we should have compassion for other humans who are being persecuted or killed or imprisoned or tortured or whatever the case may be. But I don't think that we as Jews have a particularly unique responsibility to do that because they did it to us. This is the point I'm trying to make. And I think that that the sense that I was trying to put across is this idea that, well, you guys should know better because of what happened to you. May or may not be true, but it can't be that the lesson learned from the Holocaust was Jews should know better than everyone else. I think we should all know to stand up for one another. And for sure, it's a human failing that often we don't necessarily show compassion or solidarity with others who are struggling or suffering, but aren't necessarily our tribe, our group, our family, or whatever it might be. So I do agree that we should do that. But in terms of the specificity of Holocaust lessons, I think we have every right as a people to insist that we talk about it and that we do focus on it, because all other peoples get to do that. You know, when you think of the old Corbyn formula, I am completely opposed to anti-Semitism and all other forms of racism, you know. So it's this, like, you're not allowed to mention anti-Semitism without, and Islamophobia and all other forms of racism and anti-feminism and anti-gay people. And I mean, why must the catalogue come out only for Jews? It doesn't come out the other way around. And that's what I mean about the Holocaust. The Holocaust mustn't be constantly lumped together with every other genocide. Doesn't mean I'm not sympathetic about other genocides. That's, I think, how I frame it.
What do you think, Daniel, on that question of really, I mean, I think we can have a dialogue between the specificity of what the Holocaust means to Jews and what all those of us who are implicated in the perpetration of the Holocaust need to address. Because that's the weird thing about it when we talk about the we. Because this is a mixed room. You know, I'm not Jewish, Mark's not Jewish. We've organised this not because we're super nice people, because believe me, we're really not. It's actually because we think that we, as in everybody that's not Jewish, needs to understand the Holocaust. And we are the people, I think, who understand it less than you, if there is a you. But we can't do that without actually recognising that there is a distinction there between these two experiences. And in some ways, it's the flattening out of those two distinct experiences that has got into this mess, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if I can try and answer that by talking about the civilization point, because people make the point, well, if you're going to stand up against anti-Semitism, then you have to have this broader pro-civilization type of view, and in general, for the world, which I agree with, but I think the other side of that is to understand what is specific about anti-Semitism and why Jews become the kind of signifier of civilization in some ways. And that's what people find really hard to understand. And I think to understand that, you need to understand that anti-Semitism, at least in its most developed form, it's not a prejudice that kind of undersells it. It's not discrimination. It's not just hatred in a generic kind of sense. It is, I would argue, and I'm developing these arguments on my website, it is a kind of view that the world is divided into good and evil, and the Jews are the personification of evil. So Israel is the personification of the evil of colonialism. And in the past, Jews have been seen, and still today, also it's mixed in with it, Jews are seen as the personification of the evil of speculative capitalism. And Jews have also been seen, although it might appear to contradict what I've just said, as personifying the evils of communism as well. So we have to understand anti-Semitism has a very specific character which people don't get to grips with. They just see it as a form of discrimination, and it's much, much more than that.
Could I just add a thought to that, which is it's not contradictory. That's, I think, what you're maybe saying is that's the whole point. Hatred of Jews is quite unique in that we're hated for both sides of every argument. We're hated for being smarter than people, for being stupider than people, for being capitalists, for being Marxists, for being without a state, for having our state. We're hated. We are hated for absolutely everything, and that is quite unique as far as I'm aware among hatreds. Normally racism says these people are subhuman and stupid and lower than us, and that's it. But Judaism says they are that, but they're also smarter than us and manipulating us and lying to us and controlling us. And it can't be true both ways, which is why we know that it is a real marker of people of moral twisted inversion. Because if you believe all of that stuff about Jews, you're an idiot, really.
Can I ask you who or when who's helped us most, and when have we come closest to understanding the Holocaust? Because I felt like, as an undergraduate in the very early 90s, everybody, that's when I watched the Shoah, that's when I was reading literature where the Holocaust was referred to again and again. Postmodern literature was fascinated by it. And albeit that kind of postmodern turn had a particular take on the Holocaust, which was a kind of product of the Enlightenment and a kind of hyper-rationalism, and this is where science leads us, that kind of take. But nevertheless, there was a sort of delving into the Holocaust in depth that I certainly don't think undergraduates now are experiencing anywhere, because it's all dominated by anti-colonialism, their kind of education. So where do you think we can look to help us most understand what the Holocaust was?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think that the idea, though, that you expressed, that it was a sort of hyper-rationalist scientific approach, I think it's what I was trying to say in my comments earlier, was that I think that is just one era's manifestation of it. And so I think today's manifestation is different. I don't know. For me, the Holocaust is very complex because I know I don't know enough. But I also know that however much I know, I will never know enough, because it's such an enormous and incomprehensible rupture in Jewish history and in all of our history that it is almost impossible to comprehend or understand it. And yet, that is the precise reason why we must all constantly try to comprehend and understand it. So it's not really an answer to your question, because I think that there's probably never a time when we'll understand it enough. And depressingly, like all human lives and memories and eras of history, we won't get better at it. We're going to get worse at it just because it's moving further away, which is why, to some extent, what I want never again to mean is, of course, we memorialize that, but let's not obsess over looking totally at fully immersing ourselves in it at the expense of seeing what's around us, which is, I must say, to try and stick to the Holocaust, but not. It's the first time in my life that I have ever felt this bleak about the future of Jews in this country or this continent or even in the world. And I mention it often because it's really kind of like the touchstone of my values on it. My father was a Holocaust survivor, thank God not in the camps. He was a hidden child in Italy, saved by good people, by nuns. There are good people, there were good people then. It doesn't cancel out the evil, but I think that that's what we need to focus on. We need to focus on the equivalence now without the total obsession on only looking back. Of course, we need to, learn about the Holocaust regardless.
Thank you. Okay. Oh my goodness, there's even more hands than there were before. So, do you mind if yeah, I know. I can see everybody waggling their hands at me and looking insistent. So I'm going to be judicious. Okay. The chap here in the blue skirt. This is going to be arbitrary. So forgive me. We definitely won't get to everybody. Thank you. If people can just be fairly succinct, that would be helpful.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of put in a non-Jewish perspective.
Could you just put... Yeah.
A non-Jewish perspective on this, actually, and I really do believe that it is incredibly important to get deep into the specifics, because I can recall specifically last year, February, I did a social media post that was complaining about the BBC ignoring its Jewish employees and so on, and I vividly recall a statement or sentence I made in that post that said, "Never again means never again for everyone." And what was interesting about that was that I was making a statement, as far as I was concerned, about the universalism of human rights. However, a more informed perspective that I have now, having gone much deeper on anti-Semitism, I wouldn't dare write that sentence again. I'd stand by every single part of the post that I wrote except for that sentence. And I regret making that statement because, unfortunately, growing up, I did not have sufficient understanding of the closeness, that specifics, as it were, between the Holocaust and effectively Jewishness. That actually came later, and for me, as a non-Jew, it was only studying anti-Semitism much more deeply that was a cure for that ignorance.
Thank you. You're forgiven. Okay.
Can I make one quick comment to that,
yeah.
actually? Just one quick comment, which is that it's a really interesting idea, never again for everyone. Who could disagree with that? But at the same time, it's a bit like Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. So never again for everyone and All Lives Matter can't be answers to never again. It can be universal, our lesson, but it mustn't be an answer. That's why anti-Semitism and all forms of racism is a problem. Of course we're opposed to all forms of racism. Of course never again should cover everyone. Of course all lives matter. But it's about the thinking behind it, I think, when most people say it.
Daniel.
I'd just like to say I'm not quite as bleak as Jonathan. I do recognise the dangers you talk about, so I'm not denying that. But I think that if you speak to ordinary people, and I think maybe Mark will confirm this is a kind of our fight experience, not talking to the kind of activists, but trying to speak to ordinary people about this. They are quite open to this kind of discussion, which gives me a degree of hope. The problem is that the kind of arguments that we're pulling forward, Jonathan and I on the stage now, haven't really been put forward. People have shied away of talking about the specificity of anti-Semitism. That's been the problem. And there are, in my introduction, I talked about the fact that the majority have avoided these discussions. But there are, good people. You can read Hannah Arendt, you can read Raoul Hilberg, you can read Saul Friedlander, who I think you mentioned. There are good things that you could read, good resources to get to grips with this. And we need to get to grips with the most sophisticated people against us. So I've got my prop here. This is a new book, which you probably haven't heard of because it's just come out, called The World After Gaza by Pankaj Mishra. And this is the exact opposite. This is trying to argue the case that the Holocaust has to be seen as part of a kind of the evil twin of colonialism. So we also have to engage with the most sophisticated accounts of the counter view to ours in order to be able to defeat them. So we need to understand we need to read and understand the most sophisticated arguments on our side, but also not just dismiss, but really understand and engage with the people who are against us.
Thank you. Okay, where's Casper? Could you take the lady with the red hair? Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, as I hear you talk, I've got more and more points, so I'll try and make it very short.
Really powerful one.
With respect to the Holocaust, I don't think it ever ended. It just changed its narrative. As opposing to what happened in Namibia or what happened to the blacks or what happened in South Africa. These have been atrocities that ended. But as far as the Jews are concerned, it just changed its narrative, and the world is pumping money knowingly to an organization knowingly is after the elimination of Jews in Israel. And after the 7th of October, and after it's been already established that the money that was given to Gaza in ways of aid relief and all that was funding the dungeon tunnels of hell, some countries increased the money they were giving, like Japan increased by millions its contribution, and Britain and other countries. So they knowingly supported the annihilation of Jews. They just did it in a different way. So I don't buy anything from between. The only thing that changed is the fact that instead of killing us on their own soil here in Europe, they tried to do it in our land, and then you cannot really track, trace. You need to go through the money track in order to find that point. And just two more short points about the Jews not being special to the Holocaust being really special quick to the Jews. Remove the Jews. Remove the Jews from the Holocaust. What have you got left? It was the final solution that was dedicated to the Jews, no one else. And the last thing about the school children, my children went to school here in year 5. They were taught that Anne Frank died in World War II. And when I told the teacher, no, she did not, she died because she was born Jewish, I had to write a whole letter. And I think it's very, very simple to teach children in primary school. Anne Frank died because she was born Jewish, nothing else.
So, thank you. In the next session, we will talk about representation, and particularly representation to different audiences, adult and child, through the arts. So we'll come onto that one later. I was going to take another question before, or point, ideally down here, Elisabetta, Eve. Thank you. We'll just go over by a minute.
Jonathan talked about the vacuity of the slogan, Never Again. But it occurs to me that we should also discuss the kind of vacuity of its kind of twin, which is the response that we're expected to take from the slogan Never Again, which is the idea of collective guilt. Because that also strikes me as equally sort of useless and unproductive of trying to fight anti-Semitism that of the kind that Jonathan talked about. And I know that there are members of the Jewish community who were very concerned about Elon Musk addressing the AfD conference and his sort of embrace of the idea that German collective guilt, for example, was pointless. But I think it's worth us thinking about that as an idea and how is redundant in terms of fighting today and getting people today to support the fight against anti-Semitism, how the guilt is a kind of negative, useless and sort of passive emotion that makes people resentful. You know, everybody alive today, pretty much, I'd say 7.9 billion of us are not responsible for the Holocaust, and so why make people feel guilty? This is not the way to fight anti-Semitism, and we need to also review that as a kind of policy.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask the speakers to come back for their sort of final comments and just maybe to address those two last questions. One being, which I think goes very deep about our understanding of history as it happens, is whether it's, well, you talk about rhythm. What's the term? Rhyme rather than repeating. I think, Daniel, specificity would be the thing for you, this kind of very specific moments. And then you're talking about a kind of much more of a continuum, really. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that. But then also on Eve's question there about, I suppose, the other side of the equation, what does it mean for non-Jews? How should we approach the way we look at the Holocaust? So if I come to Daniel first, and then you can have final remarks.
I can't talk about those things in 1 or 2 minutes. It's impossible.
Well, that's all you've got.
Just to make a historical point, but I think a very relevant one. So if you go back to the first part of the 20th century, in other words, before the State of Israel was founded and before the Holocaust, it's very interesting to look at the history. Say, take Germany, for example. The left-wing parties never took anti-Semitism seriously. So, even before Israel and the Holocaust. So the left-wing German parties, when anti-Semitism was rising in Germany, what would they say? They would say, we don't have any Jews in our political leadership. They then didn't recognize the centrality of anti-Semitism and fighting against anti-Semitism. And maybe if they had, and counterfactual history is always very difficult, maybe if they had recognized it, maybe they would have been able to build some kind of effective opposition to the Nazis, and maybe history would have been different. So this problem of not understanding the visceral evil power of anti-Semitism is a problem that predates the Holocaust. It predates the establishment of the State of Israel, but unfortunately is still with us today, and we really have to take it seriously.
Thanks, Daniel. Jonathan.
So, again, hard to do it briefly, but I think the idea that the Holocaust never ended is an interesting one, because certainly part of what I'm trying to say is that we're not lining up for gas chambers and being killed mechanically or, according to that kind of plan, thank God. But I think there is an element of truth in the idea that the world never stopped hating or acting on its hatred for Jews. And I must tell you, I get asked an awful lot, why are people anti-Semitic, or what's the cause for it, by people on with good intentions and bad. Some really want to know, and some say it's in the Roald Dahl style, you must have done something wrong. And I think I struggle because I don't really understand it. It's totally illogical. And as I wasn't joking earlier when I said it made people stupid if they believed all that, it does. But it's enduring and lasts forever. And when I get accused of believing that Jews are a chosen people and therefore we think we're superior and what have you, I always say no. I think what we're chosen for is to be hated. I've learned that lesson, particularly since October the 7th, 2023. And you're quite right to focus on the idea that it never ended in some respects, because of all the places we thought it might have ended, that's exactly where it happened again on that day. That is exactly where there was something resembling a pogrom, where Jews were running for their lives in images that I watched on that day, sent over the internet, thinking, gosh, that looks just like something I saw in history. And I would say that, unfortunately, there are elements of it that did never end. And in terms of the collective guilt, it's a really difficult question, because I agree that collective guilt in many respects is absurd. I'm again, to come back to a different racism issue, I'm constantly being told that I benefit from privilege for being white, and that I should have collective white guilt for black people's disadvantage historically. And I bristle at that. I think it's a preposterous idea when I get turned down for a job or an opportunity because they wanted someone black, not me. I can't get less white to improve my chances of getting a job. And so in that respect, it's preposterous for me to have to share that collective guilt. In other respects, sometimes we benefit from the historic injustice that our group had, and maybe Germany to some extent had that. But I do predominantly agree that the main focus shouldn't be on collective guilt. It should be for the past. It should be on collective guilt for the present. If we are collectively, not pointing the finger at anyone, not doing anything about the continuation of the spirit of the Holocaust, then for that we should have collective guilt. Jews and non-Jews, black and white, male, female, gay, straight, Chinese, Indian, any of us. And the same in respect to what that gentleman up there said about South Africa. In relation to anything, when I see injustices anywhere in the world, not because I'm a Jew, maybe it's bolstered, but we must all stand up against evil and bad and immorality and persecution in every respect. But today we're here to talk about the promise of never again, and never again specifically in relation to the Holocaust. So that's what we focused on.
Thank you so much.